Guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our macOS development with AppKit tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at how we can create a table view in a slightly different way than what we traditionally have done before using our NSTableViewDataSource and NSTableViewDelegate. Now, what is this other way? Well, this other way of building a table view is a more modern way of doing it. What we're going to cover today, came out with macOS Big Sur or macOS 11 back in 2020. And it is called NSTableViewDiffableDataSource. Now, if you are familiar with sort of UIKit land, that will sound familiar to you because UIKit has UI Table View Diffable Data Source and UI Collection View Diffable Data Source. Now, I don't expect you to know how to use diffable data sources in UIKit. I'm going to explain to you every step of the way what we're doing. So don't worry about that. Now, if you are familiar with UIKit, the API that we're going to be working with here is very similar to the UI table view diffable data source in UIKit, with a few key differences. And you'll be able to, and if you're familiar with UI table view diffable data source, you should be able to spot them immediately, but I will also point them out. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go into Xcode. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to go into our view controller. So inside of our view controller, you can see I have all of our user interface stuff. What I want you to do is I want you to create a lazy variable called data source and set it equal to the result of a method called make data source, like I have here in my view controller. Now, we haven't created make data source yet, but what this is going to do essentially is it's going to create an instance of NSTableViewDiffableDataSource and and set it as the value of our data source object here. Now, let's talk about why I'm marking this as lazy. Well, I'm marking this lazy because the NSTableViewDiffableDataSource object must be initialized after the view controller has been initialized. So marking it as lazy allows us to do exactly that. If you're not familiar with lazy, I'm not going to go hugely in depth on what lazy is. I have a video on it in my Swift series, but to put it simply, lazy just allows us to only load the value of a variable when we need it. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and we're going to go back into our view controller extension. I'm going to go underneath this method here. All right, let's make sure we're in the right spot. Okay, we're good. Now, the first method we're going to create here is going to be called make data source. So we'll say func make data source, and this is going to return an instance of NSTableViewDiffableDataSource. Now you can keep this, you can type out NSTableViewDiffableDataSource if you want, but we can actually do some type aliases here. So I'm going to go at the top here, and we'll say type alias, and we'll call this type alias data source equals, and this will be a type alias for NSTableView diffable data source. And then we'll need some generic type parameters. Now, NSTableViewDiffableDataSource takes in two different generic parameters. The first being the section identifier type, and then the second being the item identifier type. So the section identifier type is simply just going to be an enum that specifies a section in our data source. Now, tables don't support multiple sections, but to keep the API consistent, they added that second parameter in anyway. So we will have to create an enum for our section. We'll say section, comma, and then the item identifier type is pretty much what kind of data are you storing in your table? Is it movies? Is it shapes? Is it student information? That kind of stuff. So we have a model already, if you recall, from when we covered NSTableView initially, called movie. And this class inherits from NSObject. Now, NSObject here conforms also to hashable, which meets the requirement for the item identifier generic type. Because this particular generic type parameter, along with the section identifier type, must conform to hashable. So we'll just put movie here, like that. Perfect. So now, let's go ahead and go back down. All right. So where we're going to have our return statement, we'll say returns data source. Much more concise function signature, and it won't overflow to a new line or anything like that, depending on how big your font size is. And that is what we'll do for our make data source for now. But we need a second method, and this second method is going to be called apply snapshot. Now, we don't technically need this, but we're going to create this method for one simple reason: reusability uh, among pretty much anything else. You could argue that it also makes it testable, which it does, but that's not the primary reason why I'm creating the method. I'm creating it so I don't have to write the same code over and over and over and over again when updating the data source. Now, what is a snapshot? Well, I briefly, in passing just now, kind of mentioned what it does, but what a snapshot is it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a snapshot of the state of your data at any given point in time. Now, diffable data sources will use snapshots to be able to take the previous state of your data, compare it to the new snapshot of your data, calculate the differences using a process called diffing, and then it will go and animate those changes to your data and update the UI accordingly. Right. So the diffable data sources require that we use snapshots for it to work properly. Now, before we create this method, we do need another type alias. So below our data source type alias, we're going to say type alias, and we'll call this snapshot equals NS diffable data source snapshot. Now this takes the same generic type parameters, so section and movie, like that. All right. Now, what we'll do next is we will create our enum real quick for our section so we can make that error go away. Enum section, and enumerations are hashable by default, so we don't need to do explicit conformance to hashable. We're only going to have one case in this enum, so case, we're going to call it main. And there we go. That's our section. It's quite literally that simple. Now let's go up here. All right. So now we can create our apply snapshot method. So func apply snapshot. And this method is going to take one parameter. This parameter is going to help us determine whether or not we want to animate our changes, because we are given that option. We don't have to animate the changes if we do not want to. This is particularly helpful if, for example, you have reduce motion enabled in your accessibility settings. So you can turn off animations as needed. We'll call this animate. We'll say it's a Boolean. And we'll set its default value to true. And we don't want to return anything. So inside of the apply snapshot method, we're going to create an instance of our snapshot. So var snapshot equals snapshot. So we have a brand new instance of NSTableViewDataSource snapshot. After that, we need to append the items and the sections that we want to apply to our snapshot, to our data source, right? So that way our data source knows what we need to perform the diffing process on. So snapshot dot append sections. This takes in an array of sections, but because we only have one, we'll say dot main. Then now we need to append our items that we wanted to look at. So snapshot dot append items. And we'll just say movies, because movies is our source of data here. All right. Now we need to actually apply the snapshot to our data source. So we'll say data source dot apply, and we want the one that takes in two parameters. We want to first pass in the snapshot that we want to apply, the snapshot, and then a Boolean determining whether or not the changes should be animated. That's where we have our Boolean parameter come in, animate. And there we go. That is our method for applying a data source or applying a snapshot to our data source. Now we can actually go into our make data source method and actually populate it with something. So what we want to do is we want to create an instance of NSTableViewDiffableDataSource, and then we want to return that instance. So we can say let data source equals a new instance of our data source. Excuse me. Now this takes in a couple parameters. The first parameter it takes in is a table view that we want our data source to apply to. In this case, we want our data source to apply to our movies list. The second is a cell provider. Now, this is a closure where we put the code that will create each individual cell in our table view. This takes in 4 different parameters. Our cell provider. The first is the table view that the cell it belongs to. The second is the table column. So what column are we in? Third, it takes in the row. So what row are we in? And then fourth, it takes in an instance of the object that we specified as our item identifier type. So in this case, it'll be a movie. Now, because this closure is the last parameter of our initializer, we can make this a trailing closure. So we want table view, column, and row, and movie. Now this should return an instance of NSView, and then say in, like that. And there we go. Now, we can actually say if let table view dot make view with identifier table column dot, I believe this is this optional? Let's take a look. We'll say column. Okay, so this is not optional. That's fine. So we have a column dot identifier. We want to use the same identifier for our column that we do for our cell. We'll have owner set to nil. It's not a huge deal. We can say cell dot I see. What we forgot to do is as NS table cell view. We'll say cell dot text field dot string value equals. Okay, I think we have a slight. We may have a slight formatting issue here, so let's. Okay. Okay. So with that, okay. So inside of here, instead of our provider, the first thing we want to do is we want to get our cell. So we'll say var cell. We'll say ns table cell view. Then we'll say if our cell view equals table view dot make view with our column dot identifier, nil for the owner, as ns table cell view, like that. So we'll say we'll then say if column dot identifier dot raw value. Actually, we'll use a switch here. We'll say switch column identifier raw value. If the raw value of our column's identifier is equal to constants dot constants dot item column ID, then we'll say cell view dot text field dot string value equals movie dot title. Okay, so we have one error here. Let's take a look at what we have. We'll go issues. Um, if let there. Okay, now we have a error about consecutive statements. Let's fix that before we go on. All right. Okay. All right. There we go. There we go. That's better. All right. So now, after we have set the string value here, for that, we'll then say case constant dot director column ID. We'll say cell view dot xfield dot string value is equal to we want movie dot director, and then finally case constant dot uh, release column ID cell view dot xfield dot string value is equal to movie dot release year string, just like that. Okay. And I'm gonna have an optional chaining there. We should be okay. Okay, switch must be exhaustive. So we'll say default cell view dot text field dot string value equals unknown. All right, so we still have some optional chaining problem here. So let's okay. No. All right, cool. We should be good now. So now that we have what we want to happen when we do have a view with the given identifier that already exists, we'll say cell equals cell view. Otherwise, let's double check to make sure that our indentation is correct. Okay, yep, we're good. All right, so in our else block, what we'll do is we will say let style view equals create cell with, well, else we'll say cell equals, we'll do is I'm going to just copy this. And then we'll say var content, it's going to be a string. And then, we'll just leave the identifier as is, because that can be just kind of a universal thing here. So var identifier equals column dot identifier dot raw value. Plop that switch statement in here. Okay. I will say content equals unknown. Okay, so what I'll probably end up doing here, okay, we'll say content equals movie dot release your string. All right, and we'll say again, content equals movie.director. And then we'll get rid of, again, Get rid of that. And say content equals movie.title. All right. So now that we have that, after the switch statement, we will say cell equals create cell with content or identifier, just like that. Cool. Once we've done that, we can go outside of our if statement here and return cell. All right, so we have a place where we are trying to use self. Let's take a look at where that might be. So we'll go into the navigator. Don't want the snapshot here. Ah, okay. We'll say self.create snapshot. All right. I wish Xcode would stop opening a separate editor every time I try to go into the issue navigator, but such is life. All right, so now that we have that all done, we can then also return our data source. So return data source, like that. And there we go. Let's go ahead and try to run our code and see what happens. Okay, I'm gonna go into the toolbar here. Oh, okay, so you can see we have an empty, uh, right now we have an empty table view. Now, why is this? Well, the reason is because we need to actually apply an initial snapshot. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can jump to the definition of our view controller. We can go all the way down. And then after we configure our constraints, I'm going to say apply snapshot. And let's also make sure that our table view's data source property is set. And it is. So now let's go ahead and run it. It'll do its thing. And now we have all of our movies inside of our table. Now, this is just a list of random movies. This can be anything you want, really. But that's how we can use a diffable data source in our AppKit applications. Now, when you're modifying the user interface of your table, right, using a diffable data source, you don't have to call, for example, delete rows on a table. You could just delete the item from the source of data and then apply a new snapshot. And then it will do all the work of updating the UI for you, which is really, really nice. So, yeah, that pretty much does it for this video, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.